I never thought I'd be sharing a story like this. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but after what happened to me, I can no longer ignore what I experienced. It's been months, but every time I close my eyes, I see that night replaying in my mind, like a horror movie that never ends. It started just like any other ride, but it ended in a way I'll never forget. It was a chilly evening in early October when I decided to head home after a long shift at work. I wasn't in the mood to wait for the bus, so I opened the Uber app on my phone and requested a ride. I didn't think much of it, just another driver, another ride. I was tired, but I wasn't completely out of it. I just wanted to get home. A few minutes later, the app pinged, and I saw a car pulling up outside. It wasn't unusual, but something about this car felt different. It was an older model sedan, the kind you'd expect to see in a scrapyard or parked on the side of a deserted street. The headlights flickered once as if the car was trying to decide whether or not to start. The driver was a middle-aged man with greasy hair and a face that seemed too pale. He had a strange smile, but it wasn't friendly. It was more like a grimace, like he was trying to mask something beneath it. I stepped into the car, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "How's it going?" The man didn't answer. He simply nodded, his eyes locked on the road. I glanced at the back seat and noticed something strange, a small bag or pouch tucked underneath the seat. I didn't think much of it, but my curiosity got the best of me, and I took a quick glance at it. The pouch was dark, almost black, and had strange symbols etched into it. I told myself I was just tired and imagining things. Maybe it was just some weird decor or a bag the driver used for work. We started driving, and for a while, everything seemed normal. The city lights passed by in a blur, and I leaned my head against the window, trying to relax. But that's when I started to feel it, the weight of silence in the car. The air felt thick, like something was pressing against my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though the driver hadn't spoken a word since I got in. The quiet was oppressive. After a few more blocks, I noticed that the car wasn't heading in the direction of my apartment. We were moving further away from the city, down dark, winding streets that I didn't recognize. "Hey, I think you missed my turn," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The driver didn't respond. He just kept his eyes straight ahead, hands gripping the wheel tighter. The streetlights grew fewer and farther between, and the darkness outside seemed to swallow the car whole. I could feel my heart racing now. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking a little. "Where are we going?" Still, no answer. The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened even more, and the car picked up speed. I could see the fear in his eyes now, hidden just beneath the surface. I felt a chill run down my spine, and every instinct I had screamed at me to get out of the car, but there was nowhere to run. I was stuck, alone in the middle of nowhere, with a driver who wasn't saying a word. The car turned onto an even darker road, one that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. The trees around us were tall and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like bony fingers. My stomach turned in knots as I realized just how far we had gone from the city. I opened my phone to try and check the map, but it was dead. No service. My heart pounded harder. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My fear had paralyzed me. I finally gathered enough courage to ask again, "Where are we going?" "I need to get out." At that moment, the driver slammed on the brakes and the car screeched to a halt. My head jerked forward, and I barely caught myself before I hit the dashboard. The car was now completely still, the only sound the eerie silence of the night around us. I looked up to see the driver's face now twisted into something unrecognizable. His eyes were wide open, too wide, as if they might pop out of his skull. The smile on his face was gone. In its place was a grotesque, monstrous grin, revealing yellow, jagged teeth. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's happening?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached over to the passenger seat and pulled out the pouch I had seen earlier. He opened it slowly, and what he pulled out made my stomach drop. It was a small, ancient-looking dagger covered in strange runes. The blade gleamed in the dim light of the car's interior, and I could feel the temperature drop several degrees. It was like the air itself was suffocating me. I didn't know what he was planning, but I had a feeling it wasn't good. "Please," I begged, my voice now barely a whisper. Please let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear. The driver didn't speak. Instead, he began to chant something in a language I didn't understand, his voice low and guttural. The words were foreign, alien, like they didn't belong to this world. The air around us grew heavier, the darkness outside closing in like a living entity. I could feel something watching us, lurking just out of sight. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward the car as if they had a mind of their own. And then something strange happened. The car's radio, which had been silent up until that point, crackled to life. A voice came through, distorted and distant, like it was coming from another world. "You shouldn't have gotten in the car," the voice said, its tone cold and mocking. "You should have turned back when you had the chance." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the static. The driver continued his chant, his eyes never leaving me. I tried to undo the door handle, but it was stuck. I was trapped. The fear that gripped me was suffocating. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered, and for just a split second, I saw something in the distance. Something huge, dark, and towering. It was like a shadow, a silhouette of a monstrous figure that loomed over the road, watching us. I could hear the wind pick up, howling like a beast in the distance. The driver's chant grew louder, more frantic, as if he were trying to summon something. The ground beneath the car started to shake, and the trees around us began to bend as if they were alive, reaching toward the vehicle. I thought I was going to pass out from the sheer terror. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The car was still. The wind had died down. The trees were silent. The man was staring at me, his grin widening as he raised the dagger. "You shouldn't have trusted me," he said, his voice now dripping with malice. "Now, you'll never leave." And then, with a final, blood-curdling scream, I woke up. I was lying in the backseat of the car, the driver gone, the pouch was gone, the dagger was nowhere to be found. I was alone, disoriented, and terrified. I checked my phone, and this time there was service. I immediately called a cab and fled the scene. I've never taken an Uber again, and I never will. There are some things that can't be explained, things that shouldn't be explained. But I know what I saw, and I know what happened that night. That man, he wasn't just a driver, he was something else, something evil. I don't know how I got away, but I do know one thing for sure. Some rides are best left unbooked.
Next story.
I still remember the night that changed everything. It was supposed to be a regular ride. I had just gotten out of a late shift at work, and all I wanted was to get home. My phone buzzed, signaling that an Uber was just around the corner. As I waited outside, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been nagging at me all night. It was probably just the exhaustion and the foggy weather, but something felt off. The car pulled up and I didn't recognize the make or model. I was so tired, I didn't really care. The window rolled down and a man with a stiff smile greeted me. He was in his early 30s, his hair messy but with a sharp look, as if he'd tried to tidy up quickly. He was wearing a black hoodie and dark sunglasses, despite it being well into the night. A bit unusual, but nothing too concerning. I climbed into the back seat, trying to settle in. I had no intention of making small talk. I just wanted to get home. But the moment I sat down, I noticed something strange. The air inside the car felt heavy, like something wasn't right. The leather seats felt too cold against my legs. But I ignored it, thinking it was just my fatigue talking. The ride started in silence. The driver didn't say a word, and I didn't mind. I pulled my phone out to check messages, pretending to be occupied, but my eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror. There was something about the way he was staring at the road. His eyes didn't seem to blink, just fixed ahead. I couldn't even see the reflection of his face in the mirror. A few minutes passed, and the ride seemed to drag on longer than it should have. I wasn't sure why, but I felt this growing sense of discomfort creeping up my spine. I glanced out the window, noticing how the streets had begun to look unfamiliar. I should have been near my apartment by now, but we were going down unfamiliar back roads, areas I'd never seen before. I began to feel a sense of dread as the car sped down these dark, isolated roads. The city lights were a distant memory now. Excuse me, but I think you missed the turn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The driver didn't answer. I repeated myself, my voice shaking a little, but still no response. I felt a chill crawl up my back. "Hey, you missed the turn." I live in Maplewood. You're going the wrong way. The car didn't slow. It kept accelerating into the darkness. Something wasn't right. My hands clenched into fists, my mind racing. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I pulled on the handle, panic beginning to rise. I could hear my breath getting heavier, more labored. The air felt thick, suffocating. I had to get out of this car now. But before I could scream or do anything else, the driver's voice, low and raspy, finally broke the silence. "Don't worry," he said, without turning his head. "You're almost there." I froze. His voice was wrong, like it had been dragged through the dirt, distorted. I couldn't understand why I hadn't noticed sooner, but his voice sent a wave of terror coursing through my veins. I wanted to shout, to scream, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. It was like my throat had closed up, and my mind was becoming clouded. The car continued its path, taking turns I didn't recognize, down even darker roads. It felt like we were heading deeper into a forest or something where the trees were closing in on us. The air grew colder, and the pressure in the car increased. I could hear something faint, like whispers. It was coming from all directions. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they sounded almost like voices from the past, voices of people who had long since disappeared. "Stop the car!" I finally managed to yell, my heart hammering in my chest. "Let me out!" The driver didn't respond. He just kept driving, his face still hidden in the shadow. The more I demanded, the more I felt like the car was moving further away from reality, like I was slipping into some other dimension. Suddenly, I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. I caught a glimpse of a reflection in the rearview mirror, but it wasn't my reflection. It was the driver's face. Only, it didn't look like his face at all. It was distorted, stretched, like a mask being pulled too tight. His eyes were wide and unblinking, but his mouth was twisted into a grin that didn't seem to belong to a human. I gasped, trying to look away, but my eyes were glued to the mirror. And that grin kept getting bigger. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears as I tried to focus on anything else, but there was nothing. Only darkness outside the car and that distorted, grinning face. Without thinking, I slammed my fist against the window, desperate to get his attention. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, but my voice was barely audible over the rising din in my ears. The whispers were louder now, and I could swear I heard my name in the mix, faint but clear. The driver's head slowly turned toward me, his face still twisted in that unnatural smile. "You know what I want," he whispered, his voice even more distorted now. "You were always meant to be here." "Stop the car! Let me out!" I begged, my voice breaking. But instead of slowing down, the car sped up, and I saw something terrifying out of the corner of my eye. The road ahead wasn't a road at all. It was a massive cliff, and the car was heading straight for it. I panicked, my pulse racing. I could barely think. All I knew was that I had to get out. I kicked at the door, slamming my body against the window, desperate to escape, but nothing worked. It was as if the car itself had become a prison, and the driver, some twisted, otherworldly force, was in control. The car was inches from the edge now, and the sense of inevitability weighed down on me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. I could see my life flashing before my eyes, the face of my family, my friends, everyone I'd ever known, fading away as the darkness consumed me. Just when I thought it was all over, the car came to a screeching halt. The force of the stop threw me forward, and I collided with the seat in front of me. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, my heart still pounding in my chest. For a moment, everything was still. I was frozen in place, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I turned my head to look at the driver, but he was gone. The seat beside me was empty. The car, still parked at the edge of the cliff, was silent, no longer moving. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I wanted to scream, to run, but the fear had paralyzed me. The whispers in my ears were gone, replaced by an eerie, haunting silence that seemed to stretch on forever. With trembling hands, I reached for the door handle, and to my surprise, it opened. The moment I stepped out, the fog that had been surrounding the car seemed to part, revealing a dimly lit street. I didn't know where I was, but somehow I knew I was back in the real world. I ran, I don't know how long or how far, until I finally found myself standing on a familiar street corner. My heart was still racing, my body shaking uncontrollably. I pulled out my phone, dialing my best friend's number. When I finally spoke to her, I could barely hold it together. I explained what had happened, every horrifying detail. But when I tried to get the driver's details from the app, there was nothing. No ride history, no record of a driver. It was as if the entire night had been erased. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who or what that driver was, but I'll never forget that twisted grin, the feeling of being trapped, and the overwhelming sense that I had barely escaped something far worse than death. The Uber app has never been the same for me, and I can't bring myself to use it again. And so I'll never take a late night ride again, because I know somewhere out there, there's a driver still waiting for the next passenger.
Next story.
I'll never forget the night I took that Uber. I had been out with friends, enjoying a quiet evening at a local bar. The night was winding down, and after a few too many drinks, I knew it was time to call it a night. I pulled out my phone, opened the Uber app, and requested a ride. The usual process. I waited, checked the car's details, and saw that my driver was a man named Mark. I didn't think much of it. I'd been in Ubers 100 times before, always thinking of them as nothing more than a quick way to get home safely. But this time was different. The car pulled up after a few minutes, and I stumbled slightly as I approached. The windows were tinted, making it hard to see inside, but the car looked nice. Black, sleek, and new. I opened the door, and the smell hit me immediately. It wasn't bad, but it was odd. It wasn't the typical smell of a car or air freshener. It was something more earthy, almost like moss or wet soil. A little off-putting, but I didn't think too much of it. I slid into the back seat, muttering a tired hey to the driver. He didn't respond at first, but I figured he was focused on the road. He had short, dark hair and a thick jawline. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though it was nighttime. I couldn't see much else of him, but his lack of greeting felt strange. It wasn't rude, just distant. The car began to move. The app indicated that the ride would take about 20 minutes, so I settled back, closing my eyes, letting the cool air in the car help to clear my head. But then, about 10 minutes into the ride, I felt something shift. The car slowed down, and I blinked my eyes open, expecting us to be stuck in traffic. But no, the streets outside were empty, dark. I glanced at the GPS on my phone, but something was wrong. The map was completely blank. It wasn't showing any streets, no paths, just an endless gray void. Mark? Where are we going? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer. He just kept driving. I tried again. Hello? Mark, where are we? This doesn't look like the right way. Still no response. Now, the air inside the car felt heavier, colder, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I looked out the window, trying to make sense of where we were, but the streetlights were dimming, flickering in and out like a malfunctioning bulb. The houses on the side of the road appeared old, abandoned even, their windows broken and curtains hanging limply. A sense of dread crept in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Where was I? Why did everything feel off? Mark, I said, my voice more urgent now, please pull over. This doesn't feel right. The car didn't stop. It just kept going. I tried to reach for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, even though I hadn't heard him lock it. My heart began to race. Panic set in. I tried the window, but the button didn't work either. Mark, I screamed. Stop the car! Let me out! Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a while. You'll be safe soon, he said. The words didn't make sense. What do you mean by that? Where are we going? The car continued down the dark road. The street lights grew fewer and farther apart until there was nothing but pitch-black darkness ahead. It felt like we were driving into the void. Suddenly, there was a flash of light ahead. An old, rundown building, its windows boarded up, its door barely hanging on its hinges. The car came to a stop in front of it. Get out, Mark said, his voice no longer sounding human. It was deep, raspy, as though it were coming from somewhere else entirely. I didn't want to get out. I wanted to scream, to run, but I felt paralyzed. My body wouldn't move. My fingers were frozen to the seat. It was like the air around me was pressing me down, making it impossible to breathe, to think. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak. I was too terrified to even look at Mark. I could feel his presence, though, like a shadow looming over me. I didn't want to leave the car. I just wanted to go home. But then I heard something. A whisper. soft at first, but growing louder. Get out! You have to get out! It wasn't Mark. It was coming from somewhere inside the house. The whispers echoed through the still night air, 1,000 voices calling me. I felt a strange compulsion, something tugging at my soul, urging me to obey. My body moved against my will. I swung my legs over the side of the car and stood up. My knees felt weak, and I stumbled toward the dark house. The air around me felt thick with a strange energy. The whispers were now a chorus, chanting, pleading. Come closer. You have to come. I could barely see the house in the dim light, but I could feel the malevolent force that emanated from it. It wasn't just abandoned, it was wrong. It was alive with something dark, something ancient. I took one step forward, then another. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't stop. It was like my feet were moving on their own, dragging me toward the door. As I reached out to touch the doorknob, I heard Mark's voice again, deeper this time. Almost a growl. It's too late. The door creaked open by itself, revealing the dark interior. I stepped inside, my mind screaming for me to turn around, to run, but my body refused to listen. The air was thick with dust, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the corners of the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but there was no door, no exit. The room was closing in, and the whispers were everywhere. They were coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. All around me, 100 voices whispered in unison. You shouldn't have come. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground, my body shaking in terror. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Get out. I don't know how long I was there, trapped in that house, but it felt like an eternity. Time twisted and bent in that dark place, and all I could hear were those voices, those whispers. Finally, after what felt like hours of pleading, begging, I felt the pull again. Something reached out from the darkness, wrapping its cold fingers around me, and I was yanked back toward the door. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the backseat of the car again, the familiar sound of the engine humming. The road outside was normal. The streetlights blinked like nothing had ever happened. Mark's voice returned to its neutral tone like nothing had changed. You're home. I could barely breathe as I looked at my phone. The app said we were near my address, but I knew something was wrong. The house I had just seen, it wasn't on any map. It didn't exist. When I finally arrived home, I stumbled out of the car, dizzy and shaken. I looked back, expecting to see Mark's car drive away. But there was nothing. The street was empty, silent. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. They're always there, waiting, and I'm not sure if I'll ever truly escape them.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a short ride. I had just left a dinner with my coworkers, and it was getting late. I pulled out my phone, opened the Uber app, and requested a ride to take me home. The evening had been nice, but I was tired. Too tired to walk the few blocks back, especially in the chill of the evening. The glow of the phone screen illuminated my face as I waited for the car to arrive. Within a minute, the car icon appeared on the map. The route looked normal. My usual driver, a guy named Marcus, usually picked me up around this time, but tonight was different. Instead of the usual sleek black sedan, the car on the app was a beat-up, rusty minivan. I didn't think too much of it, assuming it was just a random ride. The app didn't give me any warnings, and I was in a rush. The car pulled up a few moments later. It wasn't exactly a minivan. It was more like an old van, the kind that probably hadn't seen much love in years. The paint was chipped and faded, and the windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't even make out the driver's face. I hesitated for a moment before stepping in. I'd heard stories about strange Uber rides, but I'd had plenty of good experiences before. I just wanted to get home. The moment I opened the door, I was hit with a strange smell, like wet carpet mixed with something I couldn't quite place. I didn't want to be rude, so I slid into the back seat, trying not to breathe too deeply. I buckled my seatbelt and said, "Hey, thanks for picking me up." The driver didn't respond. He was staring ahead, his hands gripping the wheel with unnerving tension. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled over his head, casting his face in shadow. "Where to?" he asked in a voice so quiet it barely registered. I quickly gave him the address, and we pulled out into the street. The ride was awkwardly silent. Normally, I would have tried to strike up a conversation, but something about this driver made me uncomfortable. He didn't seem to care about small talk. He just drove, and I didn't feel like pushing it. So I pulled out my phone and mindlessly scrolled through social media. As we passed the familiar blocks, I started to notice something strange. The streets we were driving on didn't look like the ones I knew. I thought I recognized a few landmarks, but they looked off, almost as if they'd been shifted or rearranged. It was like I was in a distorted version of my neighborhood. I glanced out the window and saw a shadow dart across the street. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't tell what it was, just a flash of movement. I was too nervous to mention it to the driver, and besides, it had probably been a raccoon or something. Still, my eyes darted around, my anxiety growing. "Is everything okay?" I finally asked the driver, my voice breaking the heavy silence. He didn't answer at first. The only sound was the hum of the engine. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "We're getting closer," he said, his voice flat, distant. I looked out the window again, trying to make sense of the surroundings. The trees were thicker now, and the streetlights flickered sporadically. This didn't look anything like my neighborhood. There was a sharp bend in the road ahead, and I realized we weren't on the right path anymore. "Hey," I said, growing more uneasy, "this isn't the way to my place. What's going on?" The driver didn't respond, but I could see his grip tightening on the wheel. His knuckles were turning white, and his eyes remained fixed on the road, unblinking. His silence was unsettling. I tapped the app on my phone, trying to bring up the route again, but the screen was frozen. I restarted it, but nothing worked. My heart began to race. Panic was starting to creep in. I glanced at the clock on my phone. It had only been 10 minutes since I'd gotten in, but it felt like an eternity. The road stretched out in front of us, and the trees seemed to get closer, their twisted branches reaching toward the van. I could barely make out the shapes of houses through the trees, but they didn't look familiar. They looked abandoned, run down, and wrong. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Where are you taking me?" Finally, the driver spoke again, but this time his voice was different. Low, almost guttural. "You don't need to know. Just relax." His words sent a wave of terror through me. The van turned sharply onto a narrow dirt road, and I could see nothing but the forest around us. The headlights cast eerie shadows, and I could feel the temperature in the van drop. My breath fogged up the window as I pressed myself against the seat, trying to keep my composure. I reached for the door handle, but before I could pull it open, the driver spoke again, his voice so calm it sent chills down my spine. "If you leave now," he said, "you won't make it." "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But he didn't answer. The road ahead was now barely visible. The trees closed in on both sides, and the further we went, the less I recognized the surroundings. Everything felt off. The air was thick, as if the very atmosphere was holding us in place, trapping us. I heard a noise from outside, a rustling. I turned to look out the window, but all I saw were shadows. Too many shadows. Shapes moved in the corners of my vision, and I could hear faint whispers, but they weren't from the driver. I swallowed hard, panic surging. "Let me out!" I screamed, desperate. My heart was pounding in my chest as I yanked on the door handle, but the doors wouldn't open. The van stopped. My body lurched forward as I collided with the seat in front of me. The driver didn't move. His head stayed tilted slightly forward, his hood obscuring his face. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced at my phone again, hoping for a signal. This time, the app was working, just long enough for me to see something that made my blood run cold. The driver wasn't listed. His name, his picture, everything, gone. All that remained was a blurry image of the road and the message, "Destination unknown." The whispers outside grew louder. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching the van. I dared to look out the window, my breath shallow. A figure emerged from the trees, a tall figure, its face obscured by shadows, its outline shifting like smoke. I turned back to the driver, but he was gone. The seat was empty. I was alone. Trapped. And whatever was outside wasn't human. The door handle finally gave way, and I threw myself out of the van, stumbling to my feet as I heard something chasing after me. I ran. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, until my breath was ragged and my vision blurred. I don't know how I made it back to the main road, but I did. I don't know how long I was out there, but when I finally caught a ride from another Uber, I couldn't stop shaking. The driver I got in with was kind, and the first thing I did was check the app. The ride history was there. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But I know what I saw. I know I wasn't just imagining it. That van, the driver, the strange whispers, it all happened. And every time I get into an Uber now, I can't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I'm not the only passenger in the car.
Next story.
I I don't know how to explain what happened to me that night. All I know is that I'll never take another Uber again, and I wish I'd trusted my gut when I felt that odd chill creep over me the moment I stepped into that car. It started out simple enough. I was in the middle of a trip for work, a conference in a city far from home. I'd been cooped up all day listening to boring speeches, and by the time the last session ended, I was eager to get back to my hotel, drop my things off, and find a quiet place to unwind. I called an Uber, nothing out of the ordinary. The car that pulled up was a black SUV, and the driver, a woman in her late 30s, greeted me with a warm smile as I climbed in. She had short blonde hair and wore a navy jacket. I could already tell she had that professional Uber driver vibe, polite, friendly, no nonsense. The sort of driver you don't have to worry about. "Where to?" she asked as I settled in. "Hotel downtown," I replied, giving her the name of the place. She nodded, and we drove off. Nothing strange at first. The usual city traffic whizzed by, the soft hum of the tires on the road filling the space. I was tired, my eyes half-lidded as I stared out the window, watching the glowing streetlights. But then, after a few minutes, I realized something felt off. We were no longer in the part of town where my hotel was located. I glanced up at the GPS screen on my phone, but the map was glitching. It was showing an area I didn't recognize, a section of the city that seemed darker, quieter, more isolated. I thought it was probably a mistake, some kind of app glitch, but the longer we drove, the more my unease grew. "Hey, we're going in the wrong direction," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. The woman in the front seat didn't respond at first. She just kept driving, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale. Her eyes stayed on the road ahead, never once glancing in the rearview mirror. It felt like she didn't even hear me. I noticed her breathing had changed too, as if she was holding something back. "Are you okay?" I asked, more concerned now. She finally turned her head to look at me, and when she did, I saw it. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated. There was something wrong. It wasn't just tiredness or stress. It was fear, and something else, something darker. "Are you okay?" I asked again, more urgently this time. For a brief moment, she looked at me, and I could have sworn I saw something flicker in her eyes, something not entirely human. But before I could process it, she gave a slow, controlled smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Everything's fine," she said, her voice a little too smooth. "You're just a little further than you think." I should have said something then. I should have demanded she turn around, but my body felt heavy, like I was frozen in place. Something was wrong with her, but the fear in her eyes made me doubt myself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just overthinking things. I took out my phone to check the map again. The glitch had gotten worse. The streets on the app weren't matching the real world anymore. They were twisting, bending in ways that didn't make sense. My heart started to pound in my chest. I looked out the window. The city around us was fading. The buildings were crumbling, the streetlights flickering, and the houses had all become derelict. It was like we were no longer in the city, but somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't place. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer, and in the rearview mirror I saw her lips tremble, her hands tightening even more on the wheel. We were in a part of the city I didn't recognize, an area that felt deserted. The roads had become narrower, the houses larger and more oppressive, with black windows that seemed to stare back at me like empty eyes. I felt my pulse quicken. "Why are we stopping?" I demanded. "This isn't my hotel. You're lost, aren't you?" She didn't respond. The car came to a slow stop in front of a dark, imposing building that looked more like a mansion than anything in the city. It wasn't even a building I had ever seen before. The windows were pitch black, the front door barely hanging on its hinges. I wasn't sure what came over me, but in that moment, I didn't want to be in the car anymore. I fumbled with the door handle, trying to get out, but it wouldn't budge. The locks were engaged, and I couldn't understand why. Please let me out, I begged. I'll walk from here. Just let me go. The woman in the driver's seat was now staring at me, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity I had never seen before. Her lips curled into a smile again, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something cold, predatory. You shouldn't have come, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You should never have gotten in this car. The fear coursing through me was primal now. I didn't understand what was happening, but I could feel something closing in. It wasn't just the strange woman in front of me, but something else. A presence, a shadow that seemed to cling to the air, to the car itself. Suddenly, the air in the car grew heavy, like the oxygen had been sucked out. I couldn't breathe. I felt lightheaded, dizzy, and then something terrible happened. The windows began to fog up from the inside as if someone had breathed on them from the outside. Please, I begged, my voice shaking. Let me go. The woman didn't respond. Her hands were still clenched on the steering wheel, and her eyes, those eyes, they were now pure black. Not a hint of white, not a single speck of humanity left in them. It was like she was no longer human, like she had become something else entirely. I had to get out. I had to leave. I was suffocating in that car, and I was going to die if I didn't escape. I slammed my fist against the window, screaming for help. But the streets around us were empty. There was no one. Then, without warning, the car engine revved. The vehicle jolted forward, throwing me against my seat. We were speeding down a street I couldn't recognize. The trees around us were bent and twisted, their branches reaching out like claws. I couldn't look anymore. I didn't want to see what was ahead. I closed my eyes, clutching the seat with all my might. The car suddenly swerved to a stop, and I felt myself thrown forward, my head slamming against the headrest. I opened my eyes, and the woman was gone. The car was empty. I was sitting in front of my hotel, the exact spot where I had been before I called the Uber. Everything was back to normal. The buildings, the streetlights, the people walking by, everything was fine. But I knew something had happened. Something dark, something evil. I didn't know how or why, but I knew it wasn't over. When I looked at my phone, the Uber app had a new notification, trip complete. The driver's name was gone. It was as if she had never existed. I never took another Uber after that, and I never will.
Next story.
I don't remember how long I've been using Uber, maybe a few months, maybe longer, but I do know that the convenience of the app had made me dependent on it. It was my go-to for late-night rides when I needed to get to a friend's place or just get away from the usual crowd. I wasn't the type to overthink things, not when I was just trying to get from point A to point B, especially after a long day at work. But then, everything changed the night I got in the car with him. It was around 2 a.m. on a Saturday night, and I had just finished hanging out with a couple of friends. We'd been at a local bar, drinking and laughing, but I was the first one to call it a night. I was tired and needed to get some sleep before work the next morning. The streets were quiet as I pulled up the Uber app, waiting for the usual ride. The car icon on the map came closer and closer. I had no idea where the driver was coming from, but the app didn't tell me to expect anything unusual. Then the car pulled up in front of me. It was an older model sedan, gray with peeling paint, but nothing that would have made me second guess it. I walked toward the car, the streets empty and echoing with my footsteps. The window rolled down, and I was met with the face of a man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. His expression was unreadable. His eyes were dark, deeply set beneath thick eyebrows, and his face looked tired, as if life had drained him. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, his face blank. I shrugged it off, not thinking too much about it. I got into the back seat without hesitation. The smell inside the car was strange. It was musty, like old wood and mildew. But again, I didn't let it bother me. I had been in worse cars. Where are you headed? His voice was low, almost monotone. Just downtown near the park, I answered. He nodded, put the car in gear, and started driving. I settled in, trying to focus on my phone. As the car moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The streets outside seemed too quiet. There was no one around, not a single pedestrian or other car. It was as though the city itself had fallen asleep. I glanced up at the rearview mirror to see the driver's reflection. His eyes were locked on the road, but his face looked different. His features seemed almost stretched, like something wasn't quite right. The feeling of discomfort rose again in my chest, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. We drove in silence for a while. The usual route to my apartment was taking longer than it should, though. I checked the app again, but the map didn't show any detours or traffic delays. We weren't on the usual road anymore. I hesitated, but decided to ask, "Hey, this doesn't seem like the usual way. Are we lost?" The driver didn't respond immediately. He just kept his hands on the wheel, his knuckles white. His grip seemed unnaturally tight. "We're not lost," he finally muttered, his voice still hollow. I felt a chill run down my spine as he said those words, like he had been expecting me to ask. I stared at the back of his head for a moment. I don't know why I did, but something told me I needed to look closer. His hairline was odd, too straight, like it was painted on. His neck was rigid, almost mechanical, like he hadn't moved in years. At that moment, I knew something was horribly wrong. I reached for my phone to call a friend, but the screen went black. I pressed the power button again, but nothing happened. My heart began to race. The sound of the engine seemed louder now, like it was echoing inside my head. "Can you pull over?" I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Something's wrong with my phone." The driver didn't answer, but I felt the car slow down. It wasn't a normal stop. It was like the car had made the decision for him. I felt the weight of the silence settle around me. The city outside seemed even more desolate now, like we were driving through some otherworldly space. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice trembling. The driver's lips curled into a small, eerie smile as he turned his head slightly to look at me in the mirror. "You'll see soon enough." I froze. His eyes were black, completely void of any color or warmth. It felt like they were staring straight through me, like I wasn't even there. Without thinking, I opened the door, but before I could step out, the driver slammed on the brakes. My body lurched forward and I almost hit the dashboard. I gasped, my breath shallow. "Get back in your seat," he hissed, his voice now distorted as though it wasn't his own. I pulled my hand away from the door, terrified. I had no idea what was happening. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. Something was deeply wrong, but I didn't know what it was. The car started moving again, but this time it felt slower, like we were drifting, no longer driving. I glanced out the window and my stomach dropped. The city wasn't there anymore. There were no buildings, no lights, just trees, dark, twisted trees that stretched into the sky like gnarled fingers. Where are we?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. The driver didn't respond. He just kept driving. The only sound in the car, the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle from outside. I felt dizzy, like I was losing my sense of reality. The air in the car was thick and musty, and the temperature had dropped drastically. My breath fogged up the window. I tried again to unlock my phone, but it stayed dead, unresponsive. Panic surged in my chest. I looked out again, this time seeing figures in the trees. At first I thought I was imagining it, but the longer I stared, the clearer they became. Shadowy figures, standing motionless, watching. "They're coming," the driver said, his voice colder than before. My heart pounded in my ears. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, and the figures in the trees moved closer like they were following us. I could feel their presence, the weight of their gaze. I wanted to scream, to break free, but I was paralyzed in fear. And then, as quickly as it had all started, the car jerked to a halt. The driver looked at me one last time through the rearview mirror, his black eyes now glowing with a faint, unnatural light. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile, it was a grin, stretched too wide, exposing teeth that were too sharp, too white. "You're where you belong now," he whispered. The world outside the car shifted, the trees bending unnaturally, the shadows closing in. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't getting out. I was trapped. The driver's voice echoed in the air around me. "This is where you stay." I couldn't move. My body refused to respond. I was stuck, bound to this place, with nowhere to go and no one to hear me. The car door locked itself. The engine hummed louder. Then, the darkness overtook everything.
Next story.
It was an ordinary Friday night when I decided to take an Uber to a friend's house. I just finished work and I was ready to kick back and relax. The weekend was ahead, and nothing could ruin the anticipation of hanging out with good friends and good food. I ordered my ride and the app showed a car a few minutes away. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. When the car arrived, I stepped in, greeted the driver with a nod, and buckled my seatbelt. The driver, a woman in her late 20s, gave me a friendly smile. She had long brown hair tied back in a ponytail, and her uniform was neat. She seemed professional, polite, the kind of driver you'd expect in a city like mine. "Hi, how's your night going?" I asked, trying to make casual small talk. She gave a polite smile but didn't respond. Not in a rude way, but in a quiet, reserved way. I thought maybe she just wasn't in the mood for conversation, and that was fine with me. I plugged in my phone to charge, leaned back in my seat, and let the ride unfold in silence. But there was something about the ride that felt off. It wasn't the car itself, it was the way everything around us seemed to become darker as we drove. We were in a well-lit neighborhood, but the streetlights seemed to grow dimmer as we moved farther into the outskirts of the city. The houses began to look older, run down, and then the homes disappeared altogether, leaving just a few scattered street lamps and trees lining the road. I glanced at my phone, glanced at my map to see how much longer the ride would be. But my heart skipped a beat when I saw that the map was completely blank. There were no streets, no routes, just a blank white screen. I stared at it for a few seconds and then checked the app again. Still nothing. Is everything okay?" I asked the driver, a little unnerved. She didn't answer, just kept driving, her eyes fixed ahead. I looked out the window at the desolate road stretching out before us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't the way to my friend's house. I'd been on this route before, and this didn't look right at all. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you missed the turn. Can you take the next exit?" "My friend's place is on the main road." She still didn't respond. The silence stretched between us like a thick fog, and I felt my anxiety rising. I was starting to get a little freaked out. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. "Can you hear me? You need to turn around." But she didn't even flinch. The car sped up slightly, and the world outside the window seemed to become even darker. The trees were now so close to the road, their limbs seemed to be reaching for the car. I swear I saw them sway unnaturally, as if they were being moved by some unseen force. A chill crept up my spine. My gut was telling me to get out. I should have asked the driver to pull over, but I felt paralyzed, like I couldn't make myself speak. It felt like the car had been driving for an eternity. The road had become even more isolated, no more streetlights, no more houses, just endless darkness stretching around us. It was as if we were traveling through a tunnel of shadows. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I leaned forward in my seat, my voice shaky. "Where are we going? This isn't the way to my friend's house. You're taking me somewhere I don't want to go." That's when the driver turned her head, and I froze. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and black, like there was nothing behind them. No pupils, no whites, just an endless void of darkness. A cold, eerie smile spread across her face. "You're going exactly where you need to go," she said, her voice disturbingly calm. It wasn't the same woman who had greeted me just minutes ago. This was something else. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. My hands fumbled for the handle, but I couldn't get it open. My heart pounded in my chest as panic set in. My phone was dead. I couldn't call for help. The app was still frozen. My only option was to try and reason with her, but I didn't know what was happening. "Please," I begged, my voice barely audible. "Please let me out. I don't want to go anywhere with you." The driver's smile grew wider, her face now so twisted I could hardly recognize her as human. The road outside had transformed. It was no longer a street, but a wide, empty highway that seemed to go on forever. I was no longer sure where we were, but I knew I didn't belong there. "You already are," she said in a whisper. Suddenly, the car jerked violently. The lights flickered and the air in the car became stifling, almost suffocating. My vision began to blur, and the whispers of something, some unseen presence, filled my ears. The trees outside weren't just swaying anymore, they were moving, closing in on the car, their limbs now like fingers, reaching toward us. And then, in an instant, the car stopped. The engine hummed softly, the darkness surrounding us pressing in on all sides. The woman's twisted face turned back to the road as if nothing had happened, as if the conversation had never occurred. She was just driving like any other Uber driver. The road in front of us was now clear, no trees, no shadows, nothing out of place. but my gut told me we were nowhere near where I'd been before. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. "Please stop the car," I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want to get out." The woman didn't acknowledge me, didn't even seem to hear me. She drove on as if nothing was wrong. A part of me thought I had imagined everything, the strange behavior, the eerie silence, the twisted face, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. Something was terribly wrong, and I had no idea how to make it stop. The next thing I knew, the car came to a halt, and the woman turned to me one last time, her face still eerily calm, her eyes black voids. "You're here," she said softly. "Welcome." I looked outside and saw nothing, just a vast, empty void. The car had stopped in the middle of nowhere, in a space that didn't belong to any world I knew. My pulse raced in my ears, I could feel my legs trembling, but I knew I had to get out. In a blind panic, I opened the door and stumbled out, falling onto the ground. I looked around, and everything around me seemed to disappear into the darkness, like I was standing at the edge of a void. The woman was gone, the car was gone, and I was left standing in a place that shouldn't exist. I don't remember how I found my way back. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was something else. But when I finally made it back to civilization, I never took another Uber ride again. I don't know what happened that night, but I know this. There are places beyond our understanding, and sometimes Uber isn't just a ride.
Next story.
It was a late night, the kind where the darkness feels heavy and the silence presses against your eardrums like a thick blanket. I'd been out at a bar with some friends, enjoying the weekend, but by midnight, I was ready to go home. I was tired, my feet sore from dancing, and my head was buzzing from the drinks. I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber to take me back to my apartment. When the app showed that the ride was nearby, I stepped out of the bar and waited for the car to pull up. A moment later, a black sedan stopped in front of me. The driver, a man in his early 40s with short black hair and a somewhat weary face, gave me a quick, curt nod as I opened the door and climbed in. His eyes met mine in the rearview mirror for just a second, and something about the way he looked at me felt strange. It wasn't an overtly unsettling stare, but it was enough to make me uneasy, like I was being studied from a distance. "Hey," I said, trying to brush off the discomfort. "Thanks for picking me up." The man nodded, but didn't reply. He didn't speak much, which I thought was fine. I wasn't in the mood for conversation anyway. The ride was smooth, and for the first few minutes I just stared out the window, watching the streetlights blur by as the city seemed to pass us. But as we neared the outskirts of town, I began to notice that the surroundings started to change. The buildings became more spaced out, and the lights began to disappear. "Where are we going?" I asked, glancing up at the driver. He didn't answer right away. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I noticed that his knuckles were white. Finally, after a few moments, he muttered, "Shortcut." That's when the unease I'd felt earlier grew into something far more terrifying. There was no reason for us to be going this way. My apartment was in a completely different direction. This road didn't even look familiar. It was just a long, narrow stretch of pavement surrounded by trees and dense underbrush. There were no streetlights, no houses, no sign of civilization. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just a detour, but the pit in my stomach was growing. I looked down at my phone to check the map, and that's when I saw it. No signal. The GPS had completely cut out. I swallowed hard, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I think you missed a turn back there. Can you take me back?" The driver's eyes flicked toward me in the rearview mirror again, his expression unreadable. "Just relax. We'll be there soon." There was something cold in his voice. It was almost as if he wasn't speaking to me, but to something or someone else. The silence in the car was deafening. My phone was still dead, and I tried to think of ways to get out. But every time I thought about opening the door, the fear in my chest gripped me tighter. Minutes passed, maybe more, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. The trees around us grew thicker, their branches twisting above the road like dark skeletal arms. I felt trapped. I had no idea where we were anymore, and with every passing second, the fear inside me grew stronger. Then suddenly, the car slowed down. My heart skipped a beat. In the distance, I saw what looked like an old, dilapidated house. It was surrounded by an overgrown yard, and the windows were dark, like the house had been abandoned for years. but there was something about it that felt alive. The air around it seemed to pulse, as if the house itself were breathing. "We're almost there," the driver finally said, his voice almost a whisper. My stomach dropped. "Where are we going?" I demanded, my voice trembling now. The driver's lips curled into a thin smile as he turned the car into the overgrown driveway. "You'll see." The car came to a stop in front of the house, the engine turning off with an unnatural quiet. I stared at the house, unable to look away as the driver turned in his seat to face me. His smile had disappeared, replaced with a cold, emotionless expression. "Get out," he said softly. I froze. "What?" "Get out," he repeated, his voice firm. Something inside me snapped. The panic that had been rising inside me exploded. "No, I'm not getting out of this car," I shouted. But the driver didn't move. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he just stared at me with those cold, dead eyes. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The man wasn't a man at all. He was a creature, a thing disguised as a human. His skin was too pale, his eyes too empty. There was a hollow, inhuman quality to him that I couldn't ignore anymore. I scrambled for the door handle, but my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't grasp it. The driver didn't say anything else. He just sat there, watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I pushed the door open and stumbled out of the car, my legs weak and unsteady. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I felt a cold wind rush past me, like it was coming from the house itself. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. The door to the house slowly creaked open as though it had been waiting for me. I don't know why I did it, but my legs carried me forward, drawn to the house like a moth to a flame. The door was ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. I could hear soft whispers coming from within, but they weren't human voices. They were distorted in a language I couldn't understand. I felt a tug at my chest, a pull I couldn't fight. As I stepped closer, I felt the temperature drop even further. The air grew heavy, thick with an energy that felt wrong. I could see shadows moving inside the house, though there was no light to cast them. The whispers grew louder, and a deep sense of dread filled my mind. And then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. No one. The driver was gone. The car was gone. I was alone. The whispers from the house grew louder, more frantic, as if something or someone was beckoning me inside. I could feel something cold brush against my skin, and I realized with a start that I wasn't alone. There were eyes watching me, hidden in the darkness, waiting for me to enter. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but I finally snapped out of my trance. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, not looking back once. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The house, the whispers, the eyes, it was all behind me, but the fear stayed with me. I finally found a road, and by sheer luck, a passing car stopped. I jumped in, not caring who it was, just desperate to get away. The driver didn't ask questions. He just took me home. I've never taken an Uber again. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear those whispers, and I wonder if that house is still waiting. Waiting for someone else. Waiting for me.
Next story.
It was a chilly evening in late autumn when I decided to order an Uber. I had been at a friend's wedding all day, and I was exhausted. My phone buzzed with a notification from the app, "Your ride is on its way," and I stepped out of the venue, hoping for a smooth ride home. Little did I know, my night was about to take a turn into something far darker. The car arrived quickly, a black sedan with tinted windows. I slid into the back seat, greeted by a driver who barely looked up from his rearview mirror. He was a man in his late 50s, graying hair and an old, faded jacket that seemed a bit out of place for a ride in the city. But I didn't think much of it at the time. It was late, and I just wanted to get home. "Hey, thanks for picking me up," I said, trying to make small talk. He nodded, his eyes remaining fixed on the road. "No problem," he muttered in a low, gravelly voice. I settled into the back seat, glancing out the window at the dim city lights. As we left the venue behind, I noticed that the streets began to look more unfamiliar. We were driving away from downtown into the quieter, less populated areas. The road ahead was dark, and the houses became more spaced out, the occasional flickering streetlight barely illuminating the path. I looked at my phone. The map was showing a route that didn't make sense. I knew my apartment was back the other way, and we were veering into the outskirts of the city. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe there had been some detour or roadblock. Uh, are we going the right way? I asked, my voice uneasy. I live in the West End, and we're heading toward East Side. The driver didn't respond. He simply kept driving, his hands tightly gripping the wheel. I stared at the back of his head, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was something about the way he was driving, too steady, too methodical. A few more minutes passed, and I decided to check the map again. This time, there was no map at all. My phone had completely frozen. I tried to restart it, but it wouldn't budge. My stomach twisted with anxiety. Something wasn't right. "Excuse me," I said again, my voice shaking slightly. "Can you pull over? I need to check something on my phone." But he didn't respond. The silence in the car was oppressive, almost suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of the engine as we sped down this empty road, flanked by thick woods on either side. I pulled my seatbelt off and tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. I twisted it harder, panic rising in my chest. There was no way out. "Sir," I said, more forcefully now, "stop the car. I don't feel comfortable." Still no response. Just when I thought I might have to scream to get his attention, the car suddenly lurched to a stop. My body jerked forward against the seatbelt, and for a moment everything was still. I sat frozen in place, my heart racing, unsure of what was going on. Without warning, the driver spoke, his voice now a deep, unsettling growl. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "This place isn't for people like you." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and I turned my head to look at him. His eyes were no longer the dull, tired eyes of an ordinary man. They were dark, completely black, like two endless voids. His skin had a sickly pallor, almost gray, and there was something about his expression that made me realize he wasn't human. Before I could react, I heard something else. Movement outside the car. I turned, pressing my face against the cold window to look. The trees surrounding us were dense, their branches thick and gnarled, but in the shadows I thought I saw figures, dark shapes moving between the trunks. The air outside felt wrong, thick with an unnatural presence. My breath caught in my throat as I saw them clearly. There were people, or what looked like people, standing just outside the window. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and lifeless, their mouths stretched in eerie, silent grins. They were slowly approaching the car. Who are they?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The driver didn't look at me. His eyes were still fixed on the road ahead, his hands clenched so tightly on the wheel that his knuckles had turned white. "They're not people anymore," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Just like me, just like you." I started hyperventilating, trying desperately to open the door again, but it was still locked. I fumbled for my phone, but it remained frozen, the screen blank. There was no signal, no way to call for help. The creatures outside began to move closer, their footsteps too quiet to hear, yet I could feel them as if they were right next to me. The air was thick with the feeling of being watched, hunted even. I felt the weight of their gaze pressing in on me, and I could almost hear their voices, though they didn't speak aloud. "You can't escape," the driver whispered now, his voice distant. "You've crossed into a place where no one can leave." I screamed, finally pulling at the door handle with all my strength. But nothing happened. The car was trapped in this place, and so was I. The shadows outside pressed in closer, and the figures began to reach for the windows. Their hands were long and skeletal, their fingers claw-like and pale. Just as one of the figures touched the glass, I heard a faint clicking sound. The car door finally unlocked. Without thinking, I threw the door open and bolted out of the car, my legs shaking beneath me. The cold air hit my face, and I could see the dark woods stretching out before me. But I didn't care where I was running. I just had to get away. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding, not daring to look back. The whispers, the strange voices seemed to follow me, urging me on, pulling me deeper into the woods. I had no idea where I was going, but all I knew was that the car, the driver, and those twisted figures were behind me. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled out of the woods and onto a road that looked vaguely familiar. The night felt normal again. No more dark shapes, no more eerie figures. I flagged down a car, my voice cracking as I begged the driver to take me home. I never did make it to my friend's house that night. I've tried to tell people about what happened, but they just brush it off as a bad experience, maybe some weird hallucination from exhaustion. but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I'll never take an Uber ride again.
Next story.
I can still remember that night like it was yesterday. It wasn't the first time I'd taken an Uber, but something about that ride felt different, unnerving, even. I had just wrapped up a long, exhausting day at work and was heading home. My phone buzzed with the familiar Uber notification, and I requested a ride. As always, the app displayed a picture of the driver and the car details. It was just another ride, or so I thought. The car pulled up in front of me, and I glanced at the screen to check the name of my driver, John. The car itself wasn't anything special, just a regular sedan, nothing out of the ordinary. I opened the door, greeted him with a quick hi, and slid into the back seat. John was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and dark sunglasses. His clothes were casual, a faded t-shirt and a baseball cap. But his eyes, those eyes, they seemed too cold, too still. It wasn't just the expression, but something behind them. He didn't smile or say much as I buckled my seatbelt. I was already too tired to make small talk, so I let the silence settle between us. The ride started like any other. He didn't take the usual route home, but I didn't mind. I'd always been a bit of a wanderer, and a new path was never a bad thing. As we turned onto unfamiliar streets, I didn't think twice about it. The traffic was light, and the hum of the engine mixed with the soft background music coming from the radio. My eyes started to flutter as I drifted into a half-sleep, still holding my phone in my hand, scrolling through Instagram, when suddenly the car slowed down. At first, I thought nothing of it. Traffic? Maybe. But then, the car came to a complete stop. I looked up from my phone and saw that we were now on a narrow, dimly lit street. There were no other cars around, just the eerie silence of an empty neighborhood. The headlights cast long shadows on abandoned houses and overgrown lawns. It felt wrong. John, what's going on?" I asked, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. He didn't answer right away. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I could see the veins in his hands bulging slightly, as if he was trying to control some inner tension. The car sat there for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching longer than it should have. Finally, he spoke in a low, almost whispering voice. "We're almost there." "Almost where?" I asked, my heart pounding a little faster. But before he could respond, the app on my phone buzzed, and I glanced at it in confusion. The map had glitched, showing me an entirely different location, far from where we were supposed to be going. The dot on the screen was nowhere near my destination, and my phone began to lag as if something was interfering with it. I looked up again, expecting to see a rational explanation, but all I saw was John, sitting there, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, and this time I could feel it. He was watching me. "John, I'm not comfortable. Can you turn around and take me home?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. For a brief moment, I thought he might actually listen, but instead, he gave a small, strange smile, too small, too strange, and turned the steering wheel. The car jerked forward and began to accelerate down the road, heading even further into this desolate neighborhood. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow, and my thoughts raced. What was happening? This wasn't right. "John, please stop the car. I want to get out," I demanded, panic setting in. He didn't respond. His expression remained blank, his eyes fixed ahead, unblinking. I reached for the door handle, but before I could pull it open, the locks clicked, sealing me in. My stomach twisted with dread, and a chill ran down my spine. Out of nowhere, the radio crackled, the music cutting out, replaced by static. Then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer. "Help me." "Please." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice, it sounded like it was coming from the back of the car. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there, just the empty back seat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I imagined it? But no. There it was again. "Help me." I slammed my hand against the window, trying to make sense of the growing panic in my chest. The car kept moving, faster now, and the trees lining the street seemed to blur together, casting strange shadows against the car. It was as though we were trapped in a loop, spiraling deeper into this nightmare. "John!" "What's going on?" I screamed, my voice shaking with fear. Finally, he spoke, his voice chillingly calm. "They don't want you to leave." I was losing my grip on reality. I had to get out. I didn't care where we were, I just needed to escape. The streetlights began to flicker as we passed beneath them, casting an eerie strobe-like effect through the car. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Help me! Get out while you can!" I glanced at my phone again, but the screen was frozen, the app unresponsive, thus sweat dripped down my forehead as I desperately tried to unlock the door. Then, suddenly, the car jerked to a stop. My body lurched forward, and I almost hit my head against the seat in front of me. The car had halted in the middle of a narrow, overgrown road. There was no turning back. Without thinking, I flung the door open and bolted out of the car, my feet pounding against the cracked pavement as I ran into the night. My heart was racing, and I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own panicked breathing. I turned around, expecting to see John following me, but the car was gone, vanished into thin air. No trace of it, no headlights, just an empty, silent street stretching out in front of me. I didn't look back again. I just ran and ran. I don't remember how I made it back to a busier street, but I must have somehow found my way out. When I reached the first group of people I could find, I called a real Uber, one with a driver who didn't feel like a shadow, who didn't make me question my own sanity. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a prank, a glitch, or something darker. But I know this for sure. I'll never take an Uber again after dark, not unless it's with someone I trust. Sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear those whispers. Help me. I don't think it was meant for me.